Most people died before spring, not from war. You probably think that the main enemies of medieval man were knight's swords, the plague, or the Inquisition. However, real death did not come with the loud clang of steel, but in the absolute silence of falling snow. Statistics from those years, if anyone had kept them, would reveal the terrifying truth about winter mortality. It was a war against nature, where humans had no weapons except patience and meager supplies. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why the arrival of spring became an even more terrible ordeal for many survivors than the most severe frosts. What if I told you that your own home was your biggest killer? A medieval hut was a structure that was not designed to retain heat during prolonged cold spells. The walls were usually made of woven branches coated with a mixture of clay, manure, and straw. This substance dried out and cracked due to temperature changes, creating thousands of microscopic drafts. The wind found every possible opening to blow precious heat outside in a matter of minutes. Repairing such cracks in winter was impossible, as the clay would simply freeze in your hands. There were no windows as we know them today, only small openings for light. They were covered with oiled cloth or ox bladders, which did little to retain heat. Sometimes these openings were simply plugged with bundles of straw or old rags. This created a perpetual twilight inside the room, even at the sunniest noon. People had to live in such darkness for months, which had a strong psychological impact. The concept of air tightness was completely unfamiliar to the builders of that era. The floor in such dwellings was always earthen, trampled by the feet of many generations. The ground froze through, turning into an icy monolith that sucked the energy out of your feet. No skins or straw mats could completely insulate a person from this cold. Walking barefoot was tantamount to suicide, so shoes were often not taken off at all. Dampness from the ground rose up, soaking clothes and bedding. By morning, all surfaces in the house were covered with a thin crust of frost. The thatched roof was the only barrier between the inhabitants and tons of snow. It often leaked during thaws, filling the house with icy drips. Water fell on the sleeping places, making sleep impossible and dangerous to health. The wet straw began to rot, spreading a heavy, suffocating smell of decay. The weight of the snow could collapse the dilapidated structure onto the sleeping heads at any moment. Repairing the roof in winter was deadly dangerous because of the slippery ice. The interior of the house was rarely divided into rooms by partitions. It was a single space where the whole family lived. The absence of walls inside helped to better distribute the heat from the hearth throughout the entire area. However, it also meant a complete lack of personal space for anyone. People were forced to live in constant cramped conditions, literally shoulder to shoulder. The psychological tension in such an environment grew with each day of isolation. The doors were made of nailed-together boards that rarely fit tightly against the doorposts. Snow constantly blew into the living quarters through the cracks under the door. To conserve heat in any way possible, the entrance was covered with heavy skins or thick fabric. But every time someone entered or left, the house lost a huge amount of heated air. Therefore, going outside unnecessarily was considered wasteful and foolish. Life came to a standstill within these four walls for many months. The furniture in the house was primitive and cold, made of rough wood. Sitting on a bench or chest against the wall meant pressing your back against an icy surface. People tried to stay closer to the center of the room, closer to the source of fire. They often slept on shared bunks to keep each other warm with their body heat. Loneliness in such conditions was physically impossible and deadly dangerous. Collective warmth was the only available resource for survival. The lack of a foundation meant that the house literally grew into the frozen ground. The lower crowns or bases of the walls quickly rotted from constant contact with moisture. The cold penetrated not only through the walls, but also from below, from the ground itself. This created a refrigerator effect, where food is stored better than people live. Every night in such a house was a test of endurance for the body. Waking up alive in the morning was considered a good start to the day. Survival depended not on the thickness of the walls, but on the ability to endure hardship. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. Could you live for at least a week in such a house without central heating? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Want to know a secret that will change your life if you suddenly find yourself in the Middle Ages? The main enemy was not even the cold, but monotonous, exhausting hunger. The winter diet of a medieval peasant had nothing in common with our ideas about food. Fresh produce disappeared from the menu with the first frosts, giving way to preserved foods. Anything that could be salted, dried, or fermented became essential for survival. The taste of food was irrelevant. Only its calorie content mattered. Meat was a rare guest on the table, and it was always heavily salted. Salt was the only preservative available, and it was used in huge quantities. Before consumption, such meat had to be soaked for hours, but it still remained tough. Constant consumption of salted food caused severe thirst, and the water was ice cold. This put additional strain on the kidneys and the body as a whole. There was no fresh meat in winter, as livestock was slaughtered in late autumn. The main dish in winter was a thick soup made from whatever could be preserved. Dried peas, beans, grains, and a little old lard were put into a pot. This concoction simmered on the fire for days, turning into a homogeneous gray mass. Any bread that remained was stale and hard as a rock. It had to be soaked in soup so as not to break your teeth. No spices were used except for local herbs, and the food was bland. Vitamins were completely absent in winter, and scurvy was common. Gums bled, teeth loosened, and joints ached from lack of nutrients. People became lethargic and apathetic, and their skin took on a grayish hue. The only source of vitamins could be sauerkraut or soaked apples. Grain was the main currency and the main hope for future survival. It was stored in chests, protected from moisture and ubiquitous rodents. But grain was not only needed for food, it also had to be saved for spring sowing. Eating seed grain meant condemning oneself to starvation the following year. Every family faced this choice: be full today or survive tomorrow. Often they had to go hungry, looking at the sacks of untouchable reserves. Hunting in winter was the preserve of the nobility. It was strictly forbidden to peasants. The forests were teeming with game, but killing a deer was punishable by death. Water was a separate problem. Rivers and wells froze over. They had to melt snow, which required a huge amount of firewood and time. Melted water was empty, devoid of minerals, and did not quench thirst. Hunger changed people, making them irritable, angry, and suspicious. Neighbors watched each other, counting the pieces of food in each other's mouths. Friendship and mutual aid gave way to the animal instinct of self-preservation. Winter tore off the mask, revealing the true nature of each person. It was not the strongest who survived, but the most resourceful and thrifty. Could you survive on pea porridge for 3 months? Don't forget to like if you appreciate variety in food. A winter day in the Middle Ages was as short as the blink of an eye. Daylight lasted only a few hours, and the rest of the time was ruled by darkness. Inside the house, where the windows were tiny and closed, twilight reigned around the clock. This constant darkness weighed on the psyche, causing depression and apathy. People lived according to the rhythm dictated by the sun, and in winter this rhythm slowed down. Artificial lighting was an expensive luxury, inaccessible to most. Wax candles cost a fortune and were used only in churches or the homes of the nobility. Peasants made do with tallow candles made from animal fat. They smoked, smelled of burnt fat, and gave off a dim, flickering light. It was impossible to read or do detailed work in such light. Candles were saved for special occasions, and people tried to make do with the light from the hearth. A splinter was the most accessible source of light for the poor. A thin splinter inserted into a crack in the wall or a special holder burned quickly and unevenly. It had to be constantly replaced, making sure that the embers did not fall on the straw. The fear of darkness was not a childish fantasy, but a reality of adult life. Not only wolves and robbers hid in the darkness, but also evil spirits. Any creak, any rustle behind the wall was perceived as a threat. People lost track of time, and days merged into one gray mass. Without clocks, people determined the time by the position of the sun or the ringing of church bells. But in a blizzard or thick clouds, the sun was not visible, and the sound of the bells was drowned out by the wind. People lived by touch, not knowing the exact time of day. This created a feeling of timelessness, of endless night. Waiting for dawn became the main goal of each night. The lack of light also affected physical health, damaging eyesight. Attempts to sew or repair tools in the dim light led to early blindness. The eyes were constantly strained, trying to make out details in the twilight. By old age, many peasants saw the world only as blurred shadows. Darkness took their eyesight slowly but surely. Glasses were an unknown and inaccessible technology. The lack of sunlight led to vitamin D deficiency and rickets. Children grew up pale and weak, their bones fragile. Adults suffered from seasonal mood disorders and loss of energy. The sun was not just a light source, it was a medicine. Its appearance was awaited like a miracle, like salvation from disease. Every clear day was a holiday. Darkness was a prison from which there was no escape until spring. It shackled the will, suppressed desires, and caused numbness. People felt small and defenseless against the vast black world. Victory over darkness was only possible with the arrival of spring. Guess what happened next with hygiene when the water turned to ice? In winter, the concept of cleanliness disappeared, giving way to an endless struggle with dirt and dampness. Washing oneself completely in a cold house was impossible and dangerous to one's life. The water cooled instantly, and a wet body in a draft was a direct path to pneumonia. People limited themselves to wiping their faces and hands with a damp cloth. Their bodies were covered with a layer of dirt, sweat, and dead skin. The smell in the house became thick, heavy, and almost tangible. The mixture of smells from unwashed bodies, rotten straw, smoke, and food created an indescribable bouquet. People got used to this smell and stopped noticing it. But for a modern person, entering such a house would be a physical shock. Fresh air was only available outside, but there the frost was deadly. Laundry was put on hold until the warmer months. Dirty clothes were simply shaken out or beaten with a stick in the cold to kill parasites. But this was of little help, and the clothes remained a source of itching and irritation. The skin under the coarse wool itched and became inflamed. The outhouse was located outside, often quite far from the house. Going there at night in a blizzard was a real feat that not everyone dared to do. People often used chamber pots or buckets placed right in the living room. The contents were taken out in the morning, but the smell remained in the room all night. This added another note to the symphony of household aromas. Unsanitary conditions were total and inevitable. Teeth were not brushed in the summer, and in the winter, oral hygiene was completely absent. Scurvy and vitamin deficiency caused the gums to become inflamed and bleed. Toothache was a familiar part of life, from which there was no escape. Teeth simply fell out or crumbled from eating hard food. Rotten teeth poisoned the body and caused constant intoxication. The smile of a medieval peasant in winter was a terrible sight. Diseases spread instantly in cramped, confined spaces. If one person fell ill, the whole family fell ill. There was nowhere to isolate the sick. They lay next to the healthy. Epidemics of influenza and colds wiped out entire households. There were no medicines, only immunity and prayer. The weak died first, freeing up space and food for the strong. The lack of hygiene was not a sign of ignorance, but a condition for survival. The energy spent on washing could be spent on heating. Cleanliness required resources, water, firewood, soap, which were not available. Dirt became a protective shell, saving people from the cold. People reverted to an animal state in order to survive the winter. What do you think was worse, the cold or the unsanitary conditions? In the next chapter, we will talk about what people did in this isolation. Despite the cold and darkness, life in the village did not come to a complete standstill. The myth that peasants only slept on stoves in winter is far from reality. Winter was a time for work that could not be done in the fields. Men repaired tools, fixed harnesses, and made furniture. Everything that broke in the summer had to be fixed by spring. The success of the future sowing season depended on the quality of this work. Tools required careful maintenance, sharpening, replacing handles, and lubricating. Wood for crafts was harvested in advance and dried by the hearth. The workshop was located right in the house, among the children and pots of food. Wood shavings and sawdust fell on the floor, mixing with straw. The sound of hammering and sawing was the background noise of winter days. The craftsmen's hands became rough from work, but they did not lose their skill. The women were busy with endless spinning and weaving. Wool and flax had to be turned into threads and threads into fabric. Caring for what was left on the farm required daily effort. The barn had to be cleaned if it was attached to the house, and the remaining livestock had to be fed. It was dirty and hard work in the cold. Carrying water, chopping wood, clearing snow from the paths. The routine never let up. Physical labor helped to keep warm by getting the blood flowing. Idleness was the coldest state. Winter was the time for processing the harvest, threshing grain and sorting vegetables. The grain was ground by hand on millstones or taken to the mill, weather permitting. Every grain counted and losses were unacceptable. Sacks of flour were the main treasure of the house, guarded more closely than the eye could see. Flour dust hung in the air, settling in the lungs along with the smoke. Weaving baskets, bast shoes, and nets was another important activity. They used vines, birch bark, and bast. Everything they gathered in the forest. These products were not only for their own use, but also for sale or exchange. A good basket could cost several eggs or a piece of bacon. Craftsmanship literally fed them. Hands were always busy, even during conversations. In winter, the men also gathered firewood in the forest. It was hard work, cutting down trees, chopping branches, dragging logs through the snowdrifts. The forest was a dangerous place, full of predators and hidden pits. But without firewood, the house would freeze in a day. So they went into the forest in all weathers. A sleigh loaded with firewood was a symbol of life returning to the home. Children were taught crafts during the long winter evenings. Fathers taught their sons how to hold an axe. Mothers taught their daughters how to spin. The transfer of knowledge was the key to the survival of the clan. There were no schools, only practice and observation of elders. Mistakes were corrected with a slap on the back of the head and personal example. By spring, the children were a year older and more experienced. Work was a salvation from madness and depression. It gave purpose, filled time, and distracted from hunger. As long as the hands were busy, the mind did not think about fear. Labor was a form of meditation and a way to preserve one's humanity. Without work, a person sank and perished. In winter, the village turned into an archipelago of lonely islands in an ocean of snow. The roads that connected the settlements in summer disappeared under the snowdrifts. Contact with the outside world was cut off for weeks, sometimes months. No news, no trade, no outside help. The village was left to its own devices, closed off in its own microcosm. It was complete isolation, comparable to a flight into space. Travel between villages was incredibly difficult and dangerous. Deep snow made walking impossible without snowshoes or skis. Horses sank up to their bellies and broke their legs in hidden pits. Wagons became useless. Sleds were needed. But even on sleds, a journey that took an hour in summer stretched to a day in winter. Travelers risked getting lost in the white silence and freezing to death. Wolves, driven mad by hunger, came close to human dwellings. Their howling at night was a constant reminder of who the real master of the forest was. Packs attacked lone travelers and even tried to break into barns. The fear of wolves was a deep, primal terror. People were afraid to leave the village without weapons and torches. The forest, a source of sustenance in summer, became an enemy in winter. The absence of trade meant that nothing could be bought. If salt, iron, or medicine ran out, there was nowhere to get more. People had to make do with what they had or ask their neighbors for help. Bartering flourished within the village, and money lost its meaning. Only food, firewood, and warm clothes were considered valuable. The economy shrank to the size of a single settlement. The church was the only gathering place where paths were trodden. Sunday service was not only a religious duty, but also an opportunity to see people. The priest was the only source of news and comfort. But if the church was in a neighboring village, no one went there during a blizzard. Spiritual life also came to a standstill, giving way to everyday concerns. God seemed distant, and the cold seemed close. If disaster struck, fire, illness, or injury, there was no help to be found. No doctor could be called, no messenger sent. People coped on their own, using folk remedies and the experience of their elders. The mortality rate from accidents increased sharply in winter. A broken leg could be a death sentence, as the person became a burden. The cruel arithmetic of survival dictated its own rules. Isolation gave rise to rumors and superstitions. People came up with explanations for what they did not understand. Any unusual natural phenomenon was interpreted as a sign. Stories about ghosts and monsters became reality in fevered minds. The information vacuum was filled with fantasies. People's psyches were deformed under the pressure of confined space. Conflicts within the community intensified as there was nowhere to escape. Old grudges resurfaced with renewed vigor, and quarrels broke out over trifles. But open hostility was dangerous, because tomorrow the enemy's help might be needed. People had to suppress their anger and learn patience and diplomacy. Social tensions grew with each passing day of winter. The harbingers of spring, birds, raindrops, patches of thawed ground, were greeted with jubilation. The first merchant to break through the snow was more important than the king. The restoration of contact with the world meant that life went on. The feeling that you were not alone in the world returned. The isolation ended, leaving scars on the soul. The winter blockade was a test of the strength of social ties. It tested whether the community was capable of acting as a single organism. Those who could not withstand the isolation went mad or disappeared into the snow. The rest became stronger and more united. The snowy desert taught them to appreciate the people around them.
Your taxes are due. I will not ask twice.
Winter did not free the peasants from their obligations to the feudal lord. On the contrary, it was often during the cold season that taxes and rents were due. The lords demanded their share of grain, meat, and firewood, regardless of the peasants' needs. Giving away the last meant condemning the family to starvation, but it was impossible not to give. The tax collectors were ruthless, backed by the force of arms. The conflict between the authorities and the people escalated to the limit in winter. In addition to taxes in kind, there was corvée labor, working on the lord's land. In winter, this could mean cutting wood, repairing castle fortifications, or clearing roads. Peasants had to abandon their farms and go to work for the lord. This took away the strength and time necessary for the survival of their own families. Working in the cold without proper food and clothing quickly undermined their health. People returned home exhausted and sick. The feudal lord's castle seemed like an unattainable island of prosperity. There were burning fireplaces, plenty of food and wine. This contrast between the poverty of the village and the wealth of the castle bred deep hatred. The church tithe was another burden from which there was no escape. The church demanded a tenth of everything that was produced, even in a year of famine. Priests threatened divine punishment on those who hid grain. The fear of hell was stronger than the fear of hunger. People carried their last crumbs to the monastery granaries, hoping for a miracle. Religion was an expensive consolation. Court proceedings were often held in winter when the lord had free time. Peasants were summoned to court for minor offenses, poaching, non-payment, boundary disputes. The fines were enormous and often levied in property. A family could have their last cow or grain supply taken away. Justice was a tool of plunder and intimidation. The law was on the side of the powerful. Military posts were a real disaster for the village. If a detachment of soldiers passed through the village, they occupied houses and demanded food. Peasants were obliged to feed and warm their defenders. Soldiers behaved like invaders, taking everything that was not nailed down. After the detachment left, the village was left devastated, as if after an enemy raid. Winter garrisons were worse than the plague. Holidays such as Christmas were a time of mandatory offerings to the Lord. Peasants had to bring gifts as a sign of loyalty. It was a veiled form of taxation disguised as tradition. In return, the Lord threw a feast for his vassals, but the peasants got only the leftovers. The holiday was for the lords, for the rest it was an extra expense. The joy of Christmas was overshadowed by poverty. Debts grew like snowballs in winter. To survive, people had to borrow grain from rich neighbors or moneylenders. The interest rates were extortionate, and in the spring, they had to pay back twice as much. Many families fell into perpetual debt bondage, losing their freedom. Winter was a time when a free man became a slave to circumstances. Credit was a noose around the neck. Hiding supplies became an art and a necessity. People dug secret pits in the forest and hid grain under the floor and in double walls. It was a dangerous game. If the hiding place was found, the punishment was severe. Social stratification became particularly noticeable in winter. Rich peasants, kulaks, survived more easily, buying up the land of their impoverished neighbors for a song. The poor died or became farmhands. Winter worked like natural selection, mercilessly weeding out the weak. By spring, the social map of the village had changed forever. Those who survived became either stronger or more dependent. Their bodies, weakened by the long winter, had no reserves to fight back. Their immunity was at zero, and any cold became fatal. People were like shadows swaying in the wind. They simply did not have the strength to work in the fields, but they had to work. They had to plow and sow despite their exhaustion, falling into the furrows. Death in the fields was a common occurrence in the spring. The melting snow led to flooding and muddy roads. The roads turned into impassable swamps, cutting off supply routes. Rivers overflowed their banks, flooding houses and basements, destroying the last of the reserves. The dampness became unbearable, with water standing in houses for weeks. Mud was everywhere, sucking people and animals in. The spring flood was the last blow of winter. The livestock that had survived the winter was in terrible condition. The animals were thin, weak, and often unable to stand on their feet. Mass livestock deaths in the spring deprived the peasants of draft animals and milk. Without a horse or an ox, it was impossible to plow the fields. People had to harness themselves to the plow, straining and dying from the effort. The loss of a cow was a tragedy comparable to the death of a relative. The appearance of the first greenery was a deceptive salvation. People pounced on nettles, quinoa, and sorrel, trying to stave off hunger. But their stomachs, unaccustomed to plant-based food, could not cope. Mass poisoning and digestive disorders finished off the survivors. Children's grass bellies swelled from hunger and dropsy. Green grass was a symbol of hope and a cause of death. Seed grain was the greatest temptation. When children cry from hunger, it is incredibly difficult not to grind the last grain into flour. Those who gave in and ate the seed stock were doomed to die the following winter. It was a terrible choice. Die now or die later. Those who survived were those who had the willpower to watch their families starve and not touch the sacks. Cruelty to themselves and their loved ones was the price of the future. Diseases that had been dormant during the winter awoke along with nature. In the warmth, bacteria multiplied faster, and rotting waste thawed. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and cholera decimated the weakened population. Spring was a time of funerals, and cemeteries grew faster than grass. The joy of the sun was replaced by mourning for the dead. Psychological exhaustion reached its limit. The hope that everything would be fine with the warmth often did not come true. The reality was harsh. The warmth came, but there was no food. Many broke down at this very moment, committing suicide or going mad. Surviving the winter physically was easier than surviving the disappointment of spring. The soul grew tired of fear and waiting. The first harvest of early vegetables did not appear until June. Until then, people had to eat what they could find on the ground, bark and roots. The 3 months of spring were a marathon for survival. Every day was a struggle for calories. Those who lived to see the first bread could consider themselves winners. But the price of this victory was enormous. The cycle closed, only to repeat itself again in a few months. The survivors began to prepare for the next winter as soon as the snow melted. The experience of the previous winter was not forgotten. It became part of their instincts. The fear of winter always lived in people, even on the hottest summer day. Spring was not the end of the trials, but only a short respite before a new battle. Which fact about medieval winter struck you the most? Are you ready to trade your warm office for heroic survival in a hut made of straw and clay? Share your thoughts in the comments, suggest topics for new historical investigations, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.